What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. This is your boy Frankie Bones. In today's video, we're going to be previewing the CDL Major V Week 3 matches coming up this weekend. Lots to talk about, some great storylines to get into, and we'll dive into here in just a couple of seconds. Quick message for you guys: if you guys enjoyed this video, please feel free to drop a like. If you guys are new, subscribe for some more Call of Duty content in the future, whether it be CDL, ranked play, updates coming on Modern Warfare 3 would be much appreciated. But without further ado, we'll hop right back into the video with everything that pertains to Call of Duty Major V Week 3. So the first thing that we'll talk about, the Minnesota Rokkr. They make a roster change heading into this final week of Major V qualifiers. They bring in Dylan Attach, which, again, looking back, was a questionable decision by them to send him to the bench. Attach will come in. Afro will head out after some subpar performances on the most recent iteration of the team with Fame on the AR. And equally, Fame will go to the sub, where he performed really well in Challengers. Should be an interesting mix and is sort of a last-ditch effort for them to make the push for champs and hang on to that 8th seed. The next thing we'll talk about, the Las Vegas Legion. They win the most important match of potentially the season. They face off against the Minnesota Rokkr this past weekend, and it was a great win for them. They really needed to have this one, and listening to the guys on the flank, it was Donnie and Standy both on the flank, really seemed like a really important win for their team. They're now 10 points back in the champs race from the 8th seed and put themselves in a really solid position to try and take the seed. We'll talk a little bit about it later on when talking about seeding for Major V as well as champs as well. Next thing we'll talk about, Optic Texas. They continue to roll two really impressive results this weekend. They 3-0 the Seattle Surge, who look really shaky at this point. You know, a very unpredictable team at this point, but a great win for them nonetheless. And they end up winning in a 3-1 fashion versus the Toronto Ultra, which I think was a really great win for them. They play the Hotel, which Toronto is a great Hotel team, and I think a lot of confidence for this Optic Texas team. A great map win-loss again, like they had in the Major 4 qualifiers, so now 4-0 on the stage. And they wrap up with the Florida Mutineers in Week 3. You know, we'll talk a little bit about their path again, but they look really, really strong in this mode. And, you know, potentially this is one where they look to continue to extend their map pool, especially in Control. But they looked really good. The only map that they lost against Toronto was a bang out on Hotel Control, where it was 5 offensive wins in a row. And it was an absolute bang out. And in a way, it's great to see from this team that can obviously take 2 offenses off of a great Hotel team, but obviously some things to shore up there in Control. The next team we'll talk about is the Los Angeles Thieves. They lose again to the Florida Mutineers. They're now 0-3 in the stage, and something to me that's really alarming is that they lose all 3 respawns, which, you know, they can be a great S&D team. Obviously, Draza working on the S&D 8s behind the scenes, and overall their team has been pretty consistent at search and destroy, I'd say, over the last few majors, but these 3 maps that I'll tell you guys is kind of a shock. They lost a Hydro Hardpoint, rather, to start the series, an Expo Control, and they lose a Fortress Hardpoint to the Florida Mutineers. Just very shocking in a way, but at the same time, they can still get to winner's bracket. They have some relatively favorable matchups here coming down the stretch in the Major V qualifiers, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But again, the breakdown put them on thin ice, and I sort of agree. It's kind of weird what's going on with this team right now. I don't know if they're testing things or what have you. They're a team that evolves at the end of the year, so it's yet to be seen. The last thing we'll talk about, and we'll talk more about in detail later on, is the battle for the 8th seed continues to heat up. There's 4 teams that are really close in terms of seeding for champs. We have Seattle at 190, Boston 180, Minnesota 160, and Vegas 150. So a lot of this will come down to the Major 5 tournament. Who ends up showing up in Toronto will be incredibly important, and we'll have the seeding set from there. The next thing we'll talk about as we pull up the Major 5 standings, there's a couple of things to talk about. I sort of divide it into 3 different groups. The first thing that we're going to talk about is Optic Texas. They are essentially looking to lock up the number 1 seed in terms of Major 5 standings. They will be in a much bigger advantage, I think, than they have been in the past. Obviously, they were last major as well, but you need to have the veto advantage for them, in my opinion. The control is a little bit shaky, and I think when it comes time for grand finals, I think that's really important as well, to be able to match up and veto against the other team that they match up with. They probably will lock up the number 1 seed, and it's really a push for number 1 overall seeding for champs. The next thing we'll talk about is that winners are really going to be pivotal for these teams pushing for the number 8 seed in champs. Talking about the 4 teams we mentioned before, Boston is 2-1, Vegas is 2-2, and Minnesota, Seattle are both 1-2. So it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, Minnesota, Seattle, 2 matches this weekend, as well as Boston and Vegas has another important one as well at 2-2. So we'll cover that a little bit later on as we get into the predictions. The last thing we'll talk about in terms of Major 5 standings is anyone going to be able to play spoiler, this weekend and the following? We've seen some teams already. Florida knocks off LAT. Are these teams that are already eliminated or quote-unquote eliminated going to be able to play spoiler and, just sort of be a banner for the cash in terms of the tournament? I think that it'll be really interesting to see who ends up turning up, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a couple of upsets along the way that, in the grand scheme of things, don't really matter to the team that wins outside of the cash, but it may have a big impact on the overall seeding for Major 5 and ultimately for champs. The next thing we'll talk about is my fantasy squad. We end up dropping a top 25 here as I bring up the graphic. And ultimately the strategy that I sort of went for was that a Beezy and Scrapper need to carry my team. And I think overall it's still a pretty good strategy. Ultimately what my team needs is we need to continue to win. It is a factor in the scoring. And Beezy just needs to pop off. He is my captain. I kind of wish I put Scrap there because throughout this entire season, his numbers have just been pretty fantastic overall, I would say. So I sort of wish that I had that extra 10% added to his score overall. But obviously, hindsight's 2020. The boys need to win. We need to carry on. I have a BZ, Scrap, Priesta, and Bance. So we'll have to see how Bance sort of plays out with the roster change with Attach coming back in. Last thing before we talk about predictions, we'll talk about overall seedings in terms of champs. And again, I'll break this up into 3 groups, which is sort of the situations that we sort of see coming up here. The first is that Optic Texas really pushing for the number 1 overall seed from Atlanta FaZe. It's going to be really important for them to get the veto advantage again. The control is looking a lot better, I would say, as of late, but overall it's going to be important if they can continue to run through winners for them to have that advantage. And they find themselves only down 15 points, and if they're able to put up a strong performance at the major, I know that Atlanta FaZe has come on with their respawn to be a little bit better here over the past couple of weeks. I think that this will be really important for them. The next thing that we'll talk about is the 3, 4, and 5 seeds. They're all pretty close between Toronto, LAT, and New York in that order 3, 4, 5. These teams are only separated by 20 points. So again, Major 5 might be a pretty large deciding factor in terms of who squares up where. And the last thing that we'll talk about is the battle at the bottom for seeding. Sort of mentioned it before in the beginning of the video talking about how close these teams actually are. Number 6 is Seattle Surge at 190. Number 7 is Boston Breach at 180. Number 8 is Minnesota at 160. And number 9 is the Las Vegas Legion at 150. So between these teams, only separated by about 40 points, but overall there is some battling and jousting sort of to go down in between. Obviously, somebody can make a massive run here at Major 5, but between the 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 seeds can be a pretty good mix. Outside of that, again, like I sort of categorized it between the different tiers of teams and what they're able to most likely accomplish at this major. I think it more makes a lot of sense to look at it that way, and we'll see who shows up. Ultimately, it's all about LAN, and that's what I think a lot of teams wish was throughout the season overall as a whole, and we're going to see who shows up to Major 5. And finally, to wrap up the video, we'll talk about some predictions for the matches coming up this weekend, the ultimate qualifier matches before Major 5, and ultimately the champ seeding to follow Major 5. And some of these matches are good, some are not so good, some are important, some are not. But we'll run through these here in order for you guys on Friday. 3 matches again. We have Florida versus London. I'll give this one to Florida in 3-2. This is a matchup that does not really matter too much, but I like the form that Florida had against LAT this past weekend, and I think they're going to be able to make something happen. Some guys in London are definitely fighting for their spots. I think Nasty, wouldn't say he's safe, but I think he might be able to make a push for staying on this roster before it becomes overhauled, as well as ASIM as well. The second matchup is LAT versus Minnesota. I give this one to LAT in a 3-1 fashion. This team's always had trouble against LAT overall. I think that LAT definitely has something to prove and is trying to gain some momentum before champs, and especially Major 5s. I'll give it to them in a 3-1. In the final matchup, to wrap up our Friday, we have Seattle versus the New York Subliners. I'll give this one to New York in a 3-1. I think New York's been a hot team right now. I think that overall their team is sort of clicking. Their ARs have become a lot more consistent, and I think they're able to get it done. I think Seattle's definitely running into some trouble, and I think their chemistry just really is not at the top level like some of the other teams are, like potentially New York. I'd say New York is probably in that top 4 over Seattle. Next, we'll move on to Saturday. 4 banger matchups, I think, in my opinion. Well, maybe not banger matchups, but 4 matchups overall, nonetheless. We have Las Vegas Legion going up against Seattle. And I don't know if this is well-wishing, but I'll give this one to the Legion in a 3-2. Again, I think that Seattle's pretty chalked. I've heard some quotes from Pred that would sort of agree with this side of the argument. I think this team is done. I think Pred and Sib are both going elsewhere, and Seattle's going to have to figure this out in the offseason, but I think there's a lot of momentum here with the Vegas Legion. I think their respawn has looked a lot better, and with their S&D just being at a different tier than Seattle, I see this being a difficult matchup for them overall. The next matchup we'll talk about is Florida versus Optic Texas. We'll only talk about it quick, though. This will be a DoorDashy challenge, I guess I should say. 3-0 by way of Optic Texas. The next matchup, again, is going to be a DoorDash. It's LAG versus Toronto. I have Toronto in a 3-0. And to round out our Saturday, we have a pretty interesting matchup between the Atlanta FaZe and Boston Breach. I'll give this one to the Atlanta FaZe in a 3-2. The respawns looked a lot better, but I like the addition of Vivid back to Boston, and gameplay-wise, this game means a ton to Boston. Maybe the Atlanta FaZe are looking to extend their map pool overall. We may see an Expo Control. We may see some maps that they're not quite as comfortable on. So I like this going the distance, but I like it going by way of the Atlanta FaZe. And finally, to wrap up our qualifiers for the rest of the season, heading into Major 5, our matches on Sunday, we have 3. Our first one is Minnesota versus Toronto. This is going to be a hot 3-0. I think that Toronto's going to run out of steam. I'm somebody that's on the Vegas bandwagon, so going to have to ride that and just assume that it's going to be a hot 3-0 here from Toronto, who's looked to be in really good form outside of what seems to be a juggernaut in Optic, Texas, at least online. The next matchup we'll talk about is London versus LAT. Again, not much to talk about here. I expect a big LAT regain this weekend, and I have them winning this one 3-0. And finally, to round out our weekend, we have Boston versus the New York Subliners. Pretty interesting one to close, in my opinion. I'm going to give this one to Boston in a 3-2. Not really sure exactly why, but maybe I just want a little bit of spice towards the end of the qualifiers, but I just think that it's going to be interesting. And New York's been a great team, but I think Boston might have a couple punches to throw here to try and get an extra 10 points towards champs. Obviously, New York has already qualified, so that definitely factors into some of the decisions here coming down the stretch. So that's going to do it for this CDL Major 5 Week 3 preview. Let me know what you guys think of my overall thoughts in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think that Minnesota will look like after the change, bring attach back into the team, moving Fame to the sub to pair with Bance. Let me know who you think is going to win the major. Let me know who you think is going to lock up that 8th seed for champs. Really, really interested to hear what you guys have to say. But that's going to do it for this episode. Really excited for these matches, and can't wait to see your guys' reactions here in the comments and the community's reactions overall in the Twitch chats, on Twitter, all that stuff. But for now, that's going to do it for this video, guys. This is your boy Frankie Bones, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Peace out.